Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am Shreya Chowdhary, an incoming PhD student at the University of Michigan. On behalf of my co-authors, Anna, Mary, Jina, Alexandra, and Koustuv, I'm excited to present our work where we ask, can workers meaningfully consent to workplace well-being technologies? Before I begin, I wanted to first define workplace well-being technologies. There are many different kinds of technology being designed and deployed in the workplace to support workers' well-being. We specifically examined workplace well-being sensing technologies, which unobtrusively collect detailed data about individuals and group interactions to intuit well-being and hopefully help employers and workers optimize their productivity and well-being. While there are hopeful applications of these technologies, they also raise a number of ethical concerns, including concerns of intrusions into workers' privacy, threats to workers' agency, and risks of dehumanization. These are especially important concerns given the history of technology-enabled workplace surveillance. In earlier decades, workplace surveillance was limited by time, costs, and resources. However, data-intensive technologies have reduced these costs and resources, and thus expanded the possibilities of workplace surveillance, making it virtually limitless. Prior research has empirically documented workers' discomfort with being tracked in any form in the workplace. Critical data studies and STS scholars have argued that the kind of emotional surveillance enabled by workplace well-being sensing technologies can subject intimate areas of the worker's self to an invasive disciplinary gaze, which can then result in workers feeling violated, dehumanized or objectified, and controlled. A critical privacy-related question regarding these technologies is whether workers can actually consent to them. That is to say, when an employer asks for workers' consent, are they fully empowered to consent? Current standard consent practices like informed consent and other methods of privacy self-management are ineffective. Prior research has demonstrated that these overly individualized practices do not meaningfully model consent. They're especially ill-suited to sensing technologies, which by design try to unobtrusively collect data without users' explicit awareness, making explicit consent very difficult. Current consent practices also do not account for contextual factors like the organizational power dynamics or workers' vulnerability in the workplace. Therefore, workplace well-being sensing technologies necessitate an approach to consent that can accommodate both the structural factors of the workplace and the complexities of the technology. Critical scholars have theorized about a more structural, power-sensitive approach to meaningful consent, which recasts consent from a purely individual choice, which is a false illusion, to a socio-technical condition experienced at the individual level, more reflective of reality. This means deprioritizing efforts to reform the procedural elements of consent, and instead, as numerous privacy scholars have argued, focusing on producing the legal, technical, and organizational conditions for consent. Outside of computing with their understanding that power dynamics and context can make no impossible to say, feminist and sex-positive scholars and activists have redefined sexual consent from no means no to yes means yes. They define meaningful consent as freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific, or FRIES. Our work adopts FRIES as a starting point for a grounded definition of meaningful consent that is sensitive to power dynamics like those in the workplace and inherently applicable to embodied interactions like technology that interacts with and collects data on your body. Recently, critical computing scholars have theorized about how to apply FRIES in a generally power-sensitive and contextual approach to meaningful consent to interaction design, like in social platforms or technologies with embodied interactions. However, consent to passive sensing technologies remains static, and consent to workplace technologies generally and workplace well-being technologies specifically remains underexplored. Our study focuses on two research questions. First, what are the challenges to meaningfully consent to well-being sensing technologies in the workplace? And secondly, what socio-technical interventions can ameliorate these challenges and support meaningful consent? The study's overall goal was to work towards a multi-layer approach, combining technical, legal, and socio-organizational interventions to support meaningful consent. To answer these questions, we conducted 6 90-minute focus groups with 15 participants with diverse perspectives on consent and privacy, the workplace, and sensing technologies. We used focus groups to enable participants to build off of each other's expertise and experience, as we thought participants might notice different challenges and refinements to interventions based on their roles, and this might lead to more robust recommendations. Each focus group consisted of 2 parts, an information gathering phase and an intervention refinement phase. In the information gathering phase, we sought to understand participants' perspectives on consent generally with respect to fries, and to a hypothetical workplace well-being sensing technology that we base off of existing technologies. In the intervention refinement phase, we showed participants sketches of technical interventions derived from prior work that might support meaningful consent. These included one technical intervention, which was the refinement to the consent agreement interface, one organizational intervention, a facilitated conversation to set boundaries around the use of the technology before consenting, and thirdly, a legal intervention or a version of HIPAA specific to employee health data. We solicited participants' suggestions of refinements to these interventions, thoughts on how these interventions may complement one another, and suggestions of additional interventions to support meaningful consent. We thematically analyzed participants' perspectives on how the workplace, technology, or both can produce meaningless consent, and synthesized 4 layers of challenges. First, facets of inherent workplace power differential. Secondly, consequences of this power differential. Third, inherent risks of the technology. And finally, technological barriers to consent. Drawing from the Consentful Tech project, we also synthesized participant suggestions for socio-technical interventions into 2 categories. First, the technology's aims and affordances, or changes to the design and mechanisms of the technology and how people interact with it. And secondly, policies and practices, or changes to the use of technology and regulation governing it. In the next few slides, I will share some of the challenges we found in our work, along with some example interventions to address them. In the interest of time, I will only be sharing some examples, and I encourage you to read the paper for a more in-depth breakdown. Some challenges could be addressed by both interventions to aims and affordances and policies and practices. For example, participants named the technology's inability to support ongoing consent as a technological barrier to consent. Participants described multiple interventions that might address this challenge, including encouraging deliberation in the consent process to preserve workers' autonomy by, for example, making the consent process more staggered and personalized, building interfaces that enable workers to better voice nuanced choices by, for example, increasing granularity by asking for consent to specific data streams rather than the whole technology, and facilitating active reflection on an adjustment of consent preferences by, for example, prompting workers to review their consent preferences in a timely, regular manner. Other challenges required more policies and practices interventions. Participants, especially US-based ones, named the fact that employers control workers' needs, specifically their ability to make a living and their right to healthcare, as a facet of the inherent power differential in the workplace that significantly challenged meaningful consent. This challenge cannot be solved purely through technological interventions, but rather may require a mixture of policies and practices both within the workplace and outside of it. Interventions could include the employer showing a strong record of trustworthy behavior, policies to support recourse in workers interrogating data practices, and additional regulation to protect workers' rights and privacy. Now, I'll briefly describe some of the implications of our findings. First, there are implications on adapting fries to workplace well-being sensing technology, as some dimensions may be more complex to support, like enthusiasm, and others more implicit. And other more implicit dimensions, like accountability and reciprocity, may be amplified within the workplace. These implications suggest that further work should be done to explore how to adapt fries to other complex contexts like the workplace. Secondly, participants emphasized the importance of establishing trust between employers and employees for meaningful consent, especially to address significant challenges like employers controlling workers' needs. Though our study surfaced some possible interventions that could help with this, there wasn't consensus on whether this is even possible. Some participants pointed out that the inherent power asymmetry leads workers to naturally and necessarily distrust their employer, and suggested stronger regulation to protect workers' rights. This connects to an open question about what role employers can and should play in supporting meaningful consent. Finally, our participants also questioned the very use of these technologies within the workplace. Participants questioned the validity of these technologies, echoing recent calls to ban these technologies, and rejected the very premise of their workplace knowing anything about their health, even if they were to consent. They propose alternative means of supporting workplace well-being, like a health stipend to use as they wished. These concerns raise the question, is consent a desirable end goal? Could consent to these systems act as a rubber stamp for unethical data collection? Taking inspiration from the Consentful Tech Project, our study was interested in how to make these technologies in their totality more consentful, meaning creating technology that in every aspect from design to deployment prioritizes bodily autonomy and respects the dignity of users. Our work has surfaced several structural barriers that need to be overcome for these technologies to be truly consentful, some of which may be significant enough that meaningful consent is impossible. For example, the potential untrustworthiness of the technology, if its insights are inaccurate, may make it impossible for the technology to satisfy fundamental conditions of privacy, like the right to remain somewhat unknown and undefinable. Our work does surface several interventions that may theoretically help mitigate these structural barriers, but whether these technologies can truly be consentful is still an open question. Our study highlights that companies should prioritize workers' interests, autonomy, and privacy in the design and deployment of workplace well-being sensing technologies. If you have any further questions, you can email me or contact me on Twitter. Thank you for listening, and thank you to my amazing collaborators and many people who gave us feedback and advice throughout our study. I will now open the floor to questions.